Hi, this is Joseph Bhartian. Welcome to this special edition of TFR Insights, sponsored by Reckon. And today we have with us once again Rob Hirschfeld, CEO and co-founder of Reckon. Rob, a lot has happened already in 2021, and one of the biggest stories that I was concerned about is Elastic. They have changed their license, kind of making it closed source server level or server side license, which was more or less a reaction to AWS, Elasticsearch, and I think Kibana. Now, there are a couple of things. There are so many layers like onion to peel here, and we can look at Amazon as the bad guy. We can look at Elastic as the bad guy. We can see some problem with the open source licensing model. We can look at open source business model. There are so many things, but there are a couple of things where we have to be kind of neutral also, because whether it's Reckon, you are leveraging a lot of open source technology, and in some cases you might actually be doing much better than the creators of that project when it comes to businesses, right? So they might see you as threat. So there are so many things. So where I want to start with is if you can just give a quick recap of what happened, very short elevator pitch.
Sure. So Elasticsearch is a publicly traded company doing very well in market, very well established in multiple service providers as partners, and also in just on-premises sell direct software. They have been under increasing pressure from Amazon, which has been creating services based on their code base and mirroring their feature sets as a standalone product that does not include Elastic, the makers of that software, as the core provider. And so this has created a huge amount of tension between those two companies, both monetizing that software very well, but Elastic feeling like they are not being included, they're not getting things back, right? That the implicit contract of open source is not being kept up in that relationship. And I say implicit because in a lot of cases, when you write software that's open source, you have an expectation that people are going to use that software in all sorts of ways. They chose a very permissive license. And the thing that sort of caused this to happen is they have chosen to modify the license of their code base, which is a very dramatic step in the open source world, to limit Amazon's ability to use that code in the future without more collaboration from Elastic. For most customers, this is noise, to be very honest, Elastic customers, but it's very real when it comes down to monetization of a code base.
No, I fully agree with you. The only thing is that changing license or dual license is nothing new. In early days, Java, if I'm not wrong, it also has dual licensing. One was more or less like aimed at corporate users, and one was just for regular users. Qt also had a similar issue, and that's when GNOME came into existence to kind of, there was a concern regarding Qt being a proprietary by Trolltech. I think that's where Linus Torvalds used to work in the early days. But there are a couple of things that we want to talk about here. Is first of all, let's look at Amazon, right? Okay, they are improving, but they are not known traditionally as, that open source, even I think their Kubernetes, distribution was open source last year, if I'm not wrong, after all these years. So now there are a lot of people at Amazon who come from, Matt is one of the folks from open source world that are changing the culture there at the company. So, but at the same time, if there is an open source project, which I think I need for my offering, and I take the project and start bundling as a service, right? Now, as much as open source also asks, or not demands, but open source in most cases tries to protect the user. If you look at FSF or OSI, that user should not be logged out by a vendor. It actually doesn't protect vendor as much. It does protect vendor in a way that if somebody makes changes, I want my changes back. That's all, Other than that, it more or less like, so if you look at open source, it tries to protect Amazon more than it protects Elastic. Essentially, that Elastic should not do anything to stop Amazon as a user from that. Now, the same thing is also that it does not mandate that you should give changes back, unless until you're not changing anything. If I'm not making any changes, I should not become a contributor. Sometimes you expect to be. Just let me finish the monologue. It's a boring monologue, but there is a problem with the way people understand open source. Is they see that open source means that you should contribute back. If you can, yes. If you're not making any changes, if you're only consuming, you don't have to. I mean, it's nice to be, but so what I'm just trying to give Amazon a benefit of doubt here, that they saw a project they wanted to use. They are, a monolith, a giant. So when they work at that scale, it literally leaves no business for anyone else, whether it's come to retail business or software. So let's talk about that point of view, that if there is an open source project and if a company like Amazon sees a value in that and they want to use it, what is wrong there?
Oh, Swap, you write down a lot of layers in this onion, and there's three that I would tease out. One is the perception of what open source should be, the community expectations of collaboration and vendors working together and software drum circles. And I actually mean that in a very positive way, right? The benefit of open source is people solving problems together and seeing how you solved a problem and you contributing something to make it a better thing, right? A community good. That ideal is expressed in different licenses, and different licenses have different requirements. Some of the licenses, like Linux license, require you, if you make modifications, to give them back to the community. What Elastic was licensed under, which was Apache, does not have those requirements, where you can keep changes that you make and not tell anybody about it and build whatever you want on top of it. So very permissive from that perspective. And those are important things from an open source perspective, but Amazon is not an open source company. And I don't mean that from how they're doing or giving them a grade or a score or anything like that. They are a service provider. So they run software for people. So the idea that somebody's going to write code and they're going to absorb it and put it into their service is ridiculous, frankly, because they are responsible for every line of code, every behavior, everything that happens. And that is not how open source really works. Now, they get the benefit of pulling in open source because people have done a lot of writing and putting code together. But at the end of the day, they're not selling their customers their code base. They're selling them the service working. And so what we have is a fundamental mentality shift between what open source is asking, which is I want to see how it works, I want to be able to add to it and contribute to it and extend it, and what a service provider has to do, which is keep the lights on and not disrupt things, which are actually opposed to what those two things pull together. And so from that perspective, we have actually a real dilemma in our market as a whole, right? Amazon and Elastic are just the two robots, duking it out in the ring. It's not actually something that's specific to them. It's specific to how our industry has been shaped in the last 10 years between service providers and open source technologists. And this is going to keep happening.
I don't think that license dictate that there should be a community around the project. There should be collaboration. License only dictate how you can't use it. Now, just the way in our political world, it was assumed that there are a lot of things that you should practice. There's no written law about it. Same goes with open source. There are no written things in license itself, but you should practice those. And also, when you do choose a license like Apache, which is like not GPL, of course, we are not talking about version 3, you are making a decision to have the ability to make things proprietary or non-free. So that is also a deliberate choice when you take. So you cannot have your cake and eat it too. That's how I see it. So if you look at this instance which happened where Amazon responded by forking it, I don't know what Elastic was thinking. Were they thinking that they can goad Amazon into that? I don't know, because fork is the reality of open source world. So either I don't know whether they lack that vision that somebody may actually. It was not Amazon, else would have forked it. So that was part of the reality. And forks are one of the strengths of open source. It gives the power to user to fork the code base. Some forks are successful. Even Google or Android, they forked Linux kernel in the early days when there was a disagreement. That fork was not that successful. Not successful, but the kernel community, they agreed and it was merged back. So it happens all the time.
It does and it doesn't. So, I mean, the reason why this feels like a bit of a Groundhog Day for this is that Elastic did fork and did change their license, and they took action, earlier about this. And what they hoped was that would put pressure on Amazon to change their behavior. So they had specific things that they wanted. They wanted more code flowing back to Elastic. And the other thing about this is not just the code, it's also trademarks. And so part of what Elastic has done, and they were pretty clear in this when they made this statement. One, they felt like they were sticking up for open source in general, not just Elastic. So they saw this as a broader issue. But they also felt that there was market confusion between what they do and what Amazon does because of naming. And so when you fork, what really happens is you're forking the code, and you are also creating a new name. You are not keeping the benefits of the name in the community. And so I think one of the things that people see with this is that if you're going to do the effort of a fork, part of the cost of the fork is to building a new brand or a new community around what that fork is. And those things have to be done very deliberately. And I believe in my read of the Elastic comments was that they didn't feel like Amazon had separated from the Elastic brand, which is controlled by Elastic, sufficiently to put, create a new product. And from a consumer perspective, that really is frustrating. That's why it's such a frowned upon thing, is to create a fork and a new project and a new brand. And so, the consumers don't really want that to happen. What they really want is one thing, and it's the consumer pressure that's supposed to keep forks from happening. So we're in this sort of funny position where, vendors are trying to satisfy consumer demand to not have the perception of a fork, and the vendors behind the scenes are forking because they can't work out their collaboration. And ultimately, if that happens, the consumers are the ones who are going to pay the price on this. And this isn't, once again, this is not Elastic and Amazon. This is what's happening more generally in the market, right? We're going to start seeing this with Kubernetes as different vendors say, I have specific needs for what Kubernetes looks like as it gets pushed into more things and the API becomes the requirement. We already see it for different runtimes, different platforms in general. It's really a challenge. I mean, we see it all the time in Linux. There's so many branches, forks, and vendored versions of Linux that it's impossible to keep up, right? You can watch these flow diagrams with hundreds and hundreds of forks and variants. And what happened a couple of weeks ago with CentOS, where Red Hat made the decision to no longer sustain CentOS as a long-term thing, has created a new burst of CentOS alternatives for people. And the market side of that on the other end is, how do you pay to sustain it? What's the revenue model that says if you're putting something in your data center or your infrastructure that's going to run for five years or 10 years and be something you can count on, there needs to be money flowed to do a sustaining operation for it. There has to be engineering to make that work. I mean, that's just the reality. And it's one of the challenges with open source today is that question of monetary, sustaining efforts.
Right. You mentioned branding and you also mentioned business model, which actually is not what opens. If you look at the licenses, that's not dictated with that. That's why there are foundations even for the open source project, and they are the legal entity who manages the branding. And that's why what happened with Istio also, where Google created their own body to make sure who can use the trademark or who can use the branding for Istio or not. But that is different. So what I feel is sometimes companies are trying to solve a business or branding problem through open source, but that is the only tool that is at their disposal, because open source does, while it does give you the leverage of, engaging with the community, but at the same time, it also weakens you because your code is out there. But Do you feel that both FSF or OSI, they kind of did not manage to, as in the early days, they did keep, like FSF came at TVization with GPL version 3, they were, kind of responding to as the market was evolving. But in the cloud or cloud native world, we are not seeing there. There are two problems that are happening. Of course, FSF and OSI, I don't know how much funding or whatever they have. But if you look at the modern open source, a majority of code base is written by corporate players. And those players are actually not worried about the same concern that were there in back in those Google, Microsoft, VMware, Amazon, Red Hat, IBM. They really don't care about who is or not using their code. So that is also changing. So yes, the concern is genuine, and also the grassroots efforts that happened early in the GPL version 3 days that are not happening. So what I'm going to ask you is that are you worried about this trend? Do you see that there should be a new license that is suitable for a cloud world? But then if you look at the kind of say corporate players have in this space, there's GPL version 3. Nobody will release the code under their license. I mean, nobody wants to touch a GPL, if you ask me.
No, they don't. What you're describing is the marketing of open source. Regardless of what it actually is accomplishing, and we definitely are seeing the perception of open source as something that people want to have as a good for its own. And I watch a lot of large companies really get behind open source at a marketing level without really articulating, and no longer feeling like they have to articulate what they're accomplishing for their users or consumers, because of that messaging, which really dilutes what open source is accomplishing for the end user. And I think that we lose sight of what it takes to sustain these projects. Having an open source project does you no good if it's not being actively maintained and being invested in as a thing, because you're building on software that is basically going to bit rot and not be maintained. So the idea that open source in itself is a self-sustaining miracle, that good things happen, especially on IT infrastructure projects that are, I think that the market is getting savvier about again. There used to be a lot of skepticism about how open source was going to work and sustain a data center. And we went through this period where it seemed like everything was going to be great because people were sort of throwing money at it. And now we're back into well, this is great, but what happens when I have a problem with it? And you're straight back into a vendor's arms, and it didn't matter that it was open source or not. When you look at it from that perspective, consumers are getting more aware that the degree to which something is open only matters to the degree to which they have a vendor supporting it, or they're investing their own efforts into supporting it. And those are really the questions that people should be asking with any software. I don't care if it's open or not, is how is it being sustained? What happens when there's problems? How do I know that the code is trustworthy? How do I know the supply chain of the code? What's the ecosystem around it? How do I extend it? How do I build it? Open source is a proxy for some of those questions. But I think what we're seeing, and the reason we're having this conversation, is that the answer is not as cut and dry as, yes, it's open. Yes, it uses this license. Okay, it's safe. The reality is there is no proxy for that. You have to do the research. You have to make sure that you're dealing with software that has a sustaining path behind it, or you're building on top of a house of cards.
What does it mean for Reckon? Because if there was no open source, would Reckon exist, or company like Reckon exist? Number one. Number two is that while you do leverage a lot of open source, you are not releasing all of your code also as open source, because you have to find a balance. I think that's the balance companies need to find. As much as we want and we would love to have everything open source, the reality is that it will always be a mix. We don't live in a utopian world. So how Reckon managed to maintain this balance? Because you have built a community, you have built a user base, and you're also ensuring that your customers don't have to have the same worries that other players have. So talk about it, what it means for Reckon.
Yeah, the Reckon journey with open source is actually very long, and one that we still talk about quite a bit. We made a decision that the core of our product would be closed and the ecosystem would be open. That was a very deliberate choice based on years and years of experience in market with predecessors to what Digital Rebar is, our product. And what we saw fundamentally was that we help customers run data centers better. We're software, they install it and they run their data center. And the extent to which they count on that software to really work was something that we felt like was we had to have the control of that. And if we did it without protections, then we weren't helping ourselves and we ultimately weren't helping our customers. But the place where they really needed to see what was happening was in the ecosystem of integrations, which is more than half of the code base, where they can actually see how we interface to all the other components in their data center. So in that case, the visibility of open source was really important, and our customers' ability to extend and change and build an ecosystem there has been really important. We do rely on open source technologies quite a bit. We build on Golang. Languages generally have been able to be very successful as a broad community base of support. We deploy proprietary and proprietary and open languages. There's components that we build on top of like CentOS, our Sledgehammer discovery image. And it's very helpful for those things to be open so we can rebuild and take pieces and parts of those things. I think the question becomes, what type of ecosystem are you trying to build? And so when you find something that is a tool or a library, it works very well for those things to be open because many people can contribute and share. Cloud Init is a library that is open, has a couple of vendors who are primary maintainers, and then people have embedded that in and it's become incredibly widely distributed. It's not a product, it's really a library. And so for any one of those things, we make a very deliberate decision. Are we part of a broader ecosystem? Can we collaborate? Are we using some technology that we feel like solves a specific problem and we could replace if we needed to? We weigh all those choices every time we bring any technology into our product stack. And it's an important thing. I will say, and this is part of our strategy as a product company, that substitutions are important. And we look at substitutions from an open source perspective. We look at substitutions from a proprietary perspective. And so when we build software, we actually build with the assumption that we're going to need to make substitutions. And that's to me part of the core technology of how things go. It's the multi-cloud world, it's the hybrid world, but it's ARM and Intel or Linux, flavors of Linux or Windows or any other technology that you build. And license is just one component of that. At the end of the day, it's really about the utility.
License is the way, if you look at it, it's more or less like I have done some work. This is the secret recipe that I have, how I want to share it so that, the whole idea of open source, let me throw that question to you, is that if we just go back, take all the steps back from what Amazon is doing, what Elastic, why do we do open source? The basic idea of open source. And then it will be easy for everybody else to understand that this is why we do that. And then these are the compromises that we are willing to make, or I have to make, because the world has changed. We don't live in a perfect world. Okay, there are red lights, but if you don't, the drivers are not careful, you cannot just blindly walk, right? You will not cross the road. So talk about why do we do open source in the first place?
Yeah, there's a lot of different rationale for different people. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do is work together on a common good. Your analogy of roads and infrastructure is a really good component, right? We count on having great roads because it makes commerce that we build on top of those things much easier, right? Without a strong road system or a telecommunication system or monetary system, right? Those common goods would not, would make it much harder for us to collaborate and work together and take advantage of each other's labor and exchange labor. So a lot of what we've been able to do with open source is we've been able to identify certain critical components of our infrastructure that are actually common good and that people work together to build. It's an amazing aspect of our technology in general. And that has been a bedrock of building innovation in how things go. The ones that are the most important in that are the ones that really become foundational components of how we build into technology. The Linux kernel is a great example. And they're very rare and they're very hard to find. And sometimes it just becomes a momentum thing. But we have technologies, and it's worth noting, we have technologies that have achieved the type even bigger footprints than, say, the Linux kernel without having to be open source, right? VMware's infrastructure has an incredibly dominant footprint. Windows and Microsoft's footprints are incredibly dominant. Apple and what Apple has built, those are not open technologies. In some cases, they're based on open technologies, but they're not themselves open technologies. And so I think it gets a little bit too far afield to assume that it has to be an open source technology for it to be universal, ubiquitous. And in some cases, it's harder. I was on the OpenStack board for a long time, and the idea of building software collaboratively across competing interests made building the software much harder to do. And so, I think that there's times when the market works really well and a collaborative environment works really well, and there's times when we can be looking at something that actually slows down because we want that collaborative benefit and that joint effort. And in those cases, it's not always clear that that's going to be the way that innovation happens. Sometimes it happens faster, right? Part of the criticism back to the Elastic piece was Elastic was actually a rewrite of Solr. And the innovators behind Elastic made a decision not to invest in Solr as a project, but start a new project and do it a different way. There aren't cut and dry answers for people at the end of the day. I know we want it to be like everything should be open or everything, people should pay into the things that they use. And it's become a very, very difficult thing, right? We're not going to all sign up for Patreon and pay our sliver of our Linux use, potentially, even though maybe we should be.
I actually fully agree with you, and I think you hit a lot of very good points. Number one is that everything should not be open source. There are cases where I do feel things should be open source. Like, for example, if I have a pacemaker, I should be able to. So there are a lot of cases where it does, a lot of government policy and a lot of other things, the critical info that should be open source so people can audit it. And the more code that is open source, SolarWinds kind of things would not happen because that code would have been seen already out there. So open source has its own advantages. There is no denying the fact, but the challenge is also that the business, how to build business around it, because you need to have good drivers on the road who do respect the law. Just because there are unwritten law, that does not mean you will not be a good citizen of the community. But at the same time, you mentioned that, you gave example of ecosystems like Apple and Microsoft, but there is only one Apple, there is only one Microsoft. There won't be companies like Rack and who are building. There will be players who will be building applications, developers. But look at iOS, iOS kicked Parler out. So then you will be playing in a very gated community where you will be at the mercy of that one big vendor. That is not the case with open source. Like, look at open source, Canonical, SUSE, Red Hat is there, and there are gazillions of, the Cloud Linux, gazillions of other companies which are there who are all getting a piece of that big pie versus only one company that controls almost 98% of that pie. So while I do agree with you that, those ecosystems are kind of monopolies. There's no player in that space. Every player is catering to that ecosystem. And more we move towards a gated app store like ecosystem, you run the risk of getting locked out also. Open source kind of eliminates that risk too.
Open source does help with that risk, but I think that people underestimate the locking effect even in open source, right? Red Hat it has their own platform. What they did with CentOS has created disruption in the market. Canonical has their own distribution package, right? They did something Snaps, which is a core piece of their infrastructure, which isn't being widely picked up. It's great for them, but they have things that lock you into their platforms, and then they expect you to pay for it, right? I mean, it's not the everybody's using the same thing, right? There's still differentiation in the market. And it is important for you to be able to see how the code works. This is the interesting thing, right? Racken could take all of our code and make it public, different than open, to a lot of people's discussion. So the idea here is that open is not just you can see my code. Open is that you can take the intellectual property that we've been building and collaborating with people on, and then use it in ways outside of my control. That is the core idea with open source. It's why people don't necessarily have that much sympathy for Elastic in this case, because they made a choice to say, yeah, take our code and do whatever you want with it. Those are benefits in the market, but they also count on a degree of goodwill in the market. It's not entirely clear how things will go, especially when somebody just takes a whole bunch of code and runs it as a service and then they monetize it. That's perfectly allowable under the way the systems are built, but it doesn't feel right to the ideals behind which people are sharing this intellectual property. And that's, I think, part of the challenge with this. I also agree with one thing you said. The need to have standardization and commonality in platforms is a very real thing for innovation. And so, the market does benefit from having dominant players who create standards upon which you can innovate on and around. Right? That's why CentOS has actually been an important thing. I keep coming back to that. It's really pulled innovation to Red Hat's brand in a way that wouldn't happen if you had to, plunk down cash for Red Hat Enterprise every time you wanted to use an operating system. And it's one of the reasons why the big cloud providers all have their own forks of Linux that they push people to from that perspective. So there's a lot of components in how all these things fit together. They're not monoliths at all.
Yeah, no, you mentioned, you gave example of lock-in with Linux and open source. That is there, but the beauty is also that you can very easily fork Red Hat and create Oracle Linux. You can very easily fork Red Hat and create CentOS, which will not be the case.
Easily is not. It doesn't, not the word I would use.
I mean, if you can have a community like Linux Mint, which can fork the whole Ubuntu from Canonical, if you can have a community like CentOS, where are 5 developers who can fork the whole Red Hat code base. So it's I mean, it's in most of these cases there are like not hundreds of developers who are working on that project. There are 4 or 5 developers, but the reality is that you can still do that. You cannot do the same thing if you don't like Windows 10. You're stuck with it. You cannot just fork Windows 10 and say, nope, I want Windows 7. I'm forking Microsoft Windows and we are creating something called DOS 8. Or you cannot do the same thing with iOS. So while the reality is their vendor lock is there, but you can very easily take that code. And of course, you need technical know-how you are going to create it. But in most cases, that happens. It happens. If you look at Ubuntu, I think they have like 1 billion or more forks of Ubuntu itself. Anyway, the point is that in most cases, open source that's why it is a successful, But I kind of like to call it collaboration and development model, not a business model. That's where things start getting kind of confusing, where people start looking at open source. And one more thing that I like is that either you do open source or you don't do open source. Don't try to find a middle ground. Hey, it's like what you said, you do some components, you release an open source, some components you don't release an open source, and you don't call it open source. But I really do not like the ideas. There's some discussion is going on Twitter as well. Let's find a middle ground. No, it's either open source or it's not open source, because the fact remains that I should be able to study the code. I should be able to edit the code. Studying itself is not enough. I should be able to edit the code. And the most important thing is I should be able to redistribute the code, being able to monetize from it. Even if you look at FSF, even their 4 freedoms dictate these, that I should be able to see the code, I should be able to edit the code, I should be able to redistribute the code. And of course, I should be able to monetize. So this is something, so finding a middle ground, I don't know what is the middle ground, that you can see the code, but cannot edit the code. You can edit the code, but you cannot redistribute the code. So either do open source or don't do.
Yeah, the challenge is it really does you very little good to see code without being able to edit and modify. And if and so here's the challenge, and one of the things that made me think, you were saying, makes me think of Open Core, which I'm not a particularly big fan of that model, because it really is designed by companies that are trying to monetize their code and then say they're open source. Here's the challenge of what you're describing and why there are so many forks of Linux. If you were in a collaborative open source project and you make a change to that code to meet your needs, which is what open source should be about, then if it doesn't make it into trunk, you have a fork. And you are now maintaining your own thing. You're not, right? The system doesn't work if changes into the code base don't make it back into the main code base that everybody picks up. And this is where things end up becoming companies owning projects. It's very hard to have a collaborative group of people maintaining a project, because if you have a change you need to make in a project, and you make that change for a reason and then start depending on that change, but the community doesn't pick up that change, you have a problem. And this is the challenge with open source in general, is that without an arbiter to say that is an acceptable change or not, then that core code base either becomes very fragmented or forked or unsustainable by the people consuming it if they start making changes that don't make it back into that main body of code. And so it is incredibly, incredibly important that when you're looking at a project, when you're using a project, if you are making a change that the community won't accept, you need to abandon that change and go with what the community has. It's why open source projects have external governance, have third parties, have rules that govern how they go, and move slowly. Because at the end of the day, if somebody's making a suggestion for a change, they have a reason for it. And if the community's not taking it, people in the community have a reason for not taking it. And working out that dilemma, or establishing what that roadmap is so that change can come in, is a very hard and actually expensive thing to do, because you have a lot of engineers working together to make this thing happen. And that's what open source should be. Right? Open source should be a group of people collaborating over a common code base, bringing their use cases, merging them in when they fit, and abandoning them when they don't. And for that to work, it takes real financial incentives around having that unified code base. And it doesn't happen very easily, and it doesn't happen very quickly. And so I think that we need to be looking at open source for the right reasons and the right benefits, and then watching for these dynamics in market where people aren't being forced back into a common code base, and realizing that you're not going to get open source from that perspective. It worked for a long time with Elastic and Amazon, and it could be that we're at a point where that pressure won't continue to force them back together. I do think that we need to recognize that, at this point, Elastic is adding considerable amounts to that code base that they consider their additions, right? Specific to their expertise, what they're working on with their customers, servicing the needs that their customers are bringing them, and what their engineers are finding in the code base. And so, that is something that Elastic has been bringing. If another company is reverse engineering that without their permission, then that that's a challenge in market. That's a competitive pressure. It's not an open source pressure.
You mentioned some very good things, was that if the code is not going to the main trunk. So the basic idea is that if your changes don't land up in upstream, that is a fork. And that is why, as much as we would like to criticize, a lot of companies, but look at Red Hat. Their policy is that upstream first. Not a single line of code lands in any Red Hat products or a service which is not in upstream. And the fact is that every company, Facebook, they maintain their own soft soft fork or Linux kernel, because you cannot work without a fork. You have to make changes locally, but then they push all those changes upstream. If those changes are not accepted, then they are dropped in their fork as well. They always, because otherwise they will create such a massive technical debt that 5 versions from now, they cannot even bring anything downstream from upstream, because the fork, the two projects have diverted so much. So yes, everybody does the fork, local fork, but everything goes upstream. If it doesn't land in upstream, and it's not just about random changes. Even big companies, their code base is not accepted at times, because as Linus says, don't solve just your problem. It should be solving everybody else's problem. A very good example is when ARM processors are coming in and they were pushing for energy efficient, and Intel engineers were like, no, our data centers, no, they just like burn like hell. We don't care about energy efficiency. We don't care about those changes. But those changes were accepted, and look at the amount of energy everybody's saving today because of those changes that ARM needed, and now everybody's benefiting from it. So it happens all the embedded devices. So, but the point is that the community, you rightly said, they might or might not take changes, but that is the reality. You have to live with the reality that you're benefiting, you're cutting down almost 80% of your work in R&D by leveraging from the work that other people are doing. The only payoff is the sum of the very specific changes that you want may not end up. So make changes that work for everybody. That is how it will work, and that's how open source has always been working. And that, so even if there are these kind of small ripples that we see, but then over time, Amazon, of course, no matter how big they are, they can write almost all the code in the world. But with right people there, I think even their culture is more about culture than you don't, at some point, like Microsoft, and they don't care about or Red Hat or IBM, they don't care about all those code, because they care about the services they're building. That's where their users are. Uber doesn't care if all of its code base is open source. It's about, nobody can beat them with the service. So if you're good at what you do, the code base, I remember talking to Richard Stallman. I know we agree to disagree on so many things, but you're like, just get so good at your work that you don't even have to care about, like, if you bake good food, and everybody knows their recipe, but not everybody can cook in the same manner. So it's I'm getting into like totally off topic, but that is the whole point, that it's a business.
No, it's you're not off topic, because this is the thing about open source. It is about solving your own problem, and we at RackN, we call this the RackN success cycle. And we work very deliberately to create a feedback loop so that one person's improvement, one company's improvement, they don't have to carry. And that is exactly the challenge with what you're talking about. That, look at Uber. Uber does use a ton of open source technology. They don't necessarily, I don't think, at meaningfully at all, turn around and open source their projects back. And I don't think they should necessarily. It takes time and effort to create something where something used internally becomes a shared community good. And that's where actually having a vendor, Mattermost is a good example as an alternative to Slack. It's an open source project that's funded by companies that are saying, hey, we want to make sure that our use of this product becomes a public good. And that is part of how you invest in these projects and make them shared infrastructure. And the success cycle that we try to build says, we're doing heavy lifting for our customers on building hardware interfaces and system provisioning and things like that have very little business value company to company, but companies have had to create their own bespoke versions of. We're trying to lift those out. And those are the things that go into our open source ecosystems. We're trying to lift those out of individuals' hands so that they can become community good. Because if one person fixes a bug, everybody should benefit. If one person improves how an operation is done, everybody should be able to benefit. That is what open source is supposed to be about. But it does take community-minded, collaborative work. It takes sometimes putting somebody else's use case ahead of your use case. It takes slowing things down and communicating how they should work. Those are the benefits of open source. It's why I have been very excited about open source in my career, and I still think it's an important force. The challenge is it only takes one or two people in the ecosystem to break those rules so that your investment in paying into a positive feedback loop for the cycle doesn't feed back into that loop. And the bigger player that does that, the harder it is to stomach that loss of that feedback loop. So in a way, everything we're describing comes back to a positive feedback loop where people using the software benefit from more people using the software and improving the software together. And if that loop is breaking or broken in a lot of these cases, then that is fundamentally changing the whole dynamics of open source as an industry.
One key term that you use there is community. And if you look at any community, we care about every member of the community. Communities are not abusive. They don't take advantage. That's the whole point of community, right? We build a community because we all share this idea. So let's help. So as you rightly said, sometimes you have to make a decision that is beneficial to X member, not directly to you. And in most cases, we are totally forgetting the whole idea of the open source is less about the code base. It's more about people and community. And sometimes when we reject that idea, when we stop being good citizen by not taking care of the community member, that's when these problems start. And no amount of license changing or business can work. You just have to be a very good community member. You just have to a rising tide lifts all boats. That should be the idea.
I think part of what the dilemma here is that with these huge companies that we feel like are very profitable and benefiting more broadly from the community, we have an expectation that they are going to pay into those cycles proportionally. And when they don't, the community has a very strong reaction about that. And so I think that is at the heart, one of the challenges with this here is that you would expect a heavier investment in community and building up the community for the people who are benefiting the most from these feedback loops. And when we don't see that happening, that does create challenges. And as a smaller player in this mix, that's something that we feel very strongly. It's hard to make a noise in an open source community when you have very big players who are moving that community to service what their needs are. And if their needs align, then that's fantastic, and we all benefit. If their needs don't align, then you've actually got a really significant problem as a consumer or as a smaller player.
I would actually go as far as saying that those players, without naming it, they are not actually a good community member, or we say in the Linux and open source, a good citizen of open source, because you are not playing as a community member. You're not taking care of each other's needs. That's the whole notion of community is broken there. So you can come as an outsider, as an abusive outsider, but you are not part of community, because that's not how communities work.
I agree with you. One of the challenges we have on these big projects is that the cost to be a participant in these communities is incredibly high. And I don't know how to deal with that, right? I could spend my whole day being in committee meetings and going to sit on TOC boards, right? Leadership boards, watching how things are built and things, and those, that's how the communities are governed. It takes a lot of time, and it's a very hard thing to do, to invest in. It's an important part of the process, and it's also something that locks out smaller players.
Rob, thank you so much for talking once again about this very, very complicated, very, very inconvenient, and at the borderline of controversial topic. We try to play safe. Just one last word for anybody who's watching is that we didn't mean to name anybody. There was no point of calling anybody out. It's just a very honest, very open, and as I said, uncomfortable discussion, because when you have any discussion like that, you do run the risk of, hey, stepping on somebody's toe, but that is totally not the idea. So even if we name any companies, the idea was not to talk about them especially. It's just in general to understand how open source is evolving. So once again, thanks for watching, and thanks for talking to me, Rob. I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you.
Swap, thank you. This was a thoughtful conversation, and I enjoyed it.